You know, I have to admit, when I usually think about architecture, I picture like these big skyscrapers
Hmm.
or like really grand old buildings. Um, but the stuff you shared with me has me thinking about this in a totally different way.
Okay.
And especially when we're talking about Latin America. I mean, we've got articles here comparing people like Aldo Rossi and Peter Zumthor.
Right.
There's one that's a deep dive into atmosphere in design, and even a whole guide to something called appropriation architecture.
Yeah, and that's what I think is so interesting about this particular set of sources.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just looking at cool buildings, but like really questioning how we think about designing cities,
Totally.
especially in Latin America.
And one of the things that really stood out to me was this one review asking if Aldo Rossi's Architecture of the City even makes sense in Latin America.
Oh, interesting.
And for anyone listening who doesn't know, it's a really important book. But Rossi was mostly looking at European cities.
Right, places that have tons of history.
Exactly, like centuries and centuries of it.
Hmm.
And he has this term, urban facts.
Yeah.
And he uses it to talk about these parts of a city that almost never change.
Hmm.
Like you think about those big avenues or like historic town squares, the
Yeah.
kinds of landmarks that really make a place what it is over generations.
Absolutely.
But then on the flip side, you've got Latin America,
Yeah,
and it's a totally different story.
it is.
So many of these cities have seen just massive growth really fast.
Right, and often really recently, too.
Yeah.
This isn't ancient history we're talking about.
Exactly. Like think about Bogota, Lima, Buenos Aires. They're all dealing with just huge growth,
Yeah.
and the design problems are just in a whole other category.
Totally. And it becomes less about preserving what was there before
Mm-hmm.
and much more about managing all this new stuff that's happening right now.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you design for that kind of energy, but still make it feel like a real place somewhere with its own identity?
Right.
That's a question I don't think Rossi really answers.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to force something to fit where it just doesn't belong.
Mhm.
You can't just take these European ideas about urban planning and just drop them into a totally different situation.
It makes you wonder if we can ever really get away from that European perspective
Yeah.
when we talk about architecture and urban design.
Right. And it's not just a Latin American thing either.
No, not at all.
I mean, how often have you been in a city and thought, like, this is nice, but no one actually lives like this?
Totally. It's like
Like,
they
you
designed
think
it
that-
without thinking about the people at all.
Exactly. And that actually leads perfectly into this other big idea from the sources you sent.
Okay.
This idea of informal settlements,
Yeah.
which are really important when we're talking about this part of the world.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because you're right. It's not just a Latin American issue, but it feels way more urgent there,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, for sure.
And this is where it gets really cool, because it's not just some abstract theory.
Right.
It's about how people actually live their lives,
Exactly.
like how they adapt and create their own spaces,
Mhm.
especially when no one's really planning things for them.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you've got Peter Zumthor, who's all about architecture as environment, like the whole experience, not just the building itself.
Right.
And then you've got Stefano Anzolini's work on appropriation architecture.
Yeah.
It's like they're looking at the same coin from two totally different sides.
Totally. And I think it's in that tension that we find some really interesting ideas. I mean, you've got Zumthor with his very specific ideas about design.
Right.
And then you have people in these informal settlements who use whatever they can to make things work.
And somehow it all comes together.
Right.
So for anyone who's not familiar with Anzolini's work, can you talk a little bit more about appropriation architecture?
Sure.
It almost sounds like it flips the whole architect-client thing on its head.
Absolutely it does, because he's saying that in these informal settlements, the people living there become the designers in a way.
Oh, wow.
They adapt and change their spaces because they have to.
Makes sense.
They might use whatever materials they can find or change things that are already there.
Right.
Sometimes they even build totally new structures to fit what they need.
So it's not some architect coming in with their big plans.
No, not at all.
It's about actually working with the community, figuring out what they need and what they want.
Exactly. And this is where I think Zumthor's ideas are really useful.
Okay, I'm listening because he seems like the total opposite of this, to be honest.
I know, right?
He's all about using the perfect materials and that really clean minimalist look.
Right. He cares a lot about the details.
So how does that work in a place where people are using whatever they can find to build houses?
Because it's not just about how things look to him. It's about the feeling you get from a space.
Interesting.
He talks about creating atmospheres with light and sound textures, materials, all of that.
And you're saying that still matters even in those situations?
Absolutely. Think about it. Even in an informal settlement, you have light coming through the roof,
Right.
or the sound of people talking echoing in the alleys,
Yeah,
even the feeling of a wall that someone built with their own hands.
I see what you mean.
All of that creates the feeling of a place.
So it's about paying attention to those little things, those spaces we usually ignore.
Exactly. They become like hidden opportunities for design.
Yeah, it's not just about the building itself anymore, but what's happening around it.
Exactly. And when you start to see it that way, a whole world opens up.
Mhm.
It's not just about putting a roof over your head, but making a space where people can feel connected.
Wow, that's a really powerful way to look at it.
And it makes you think, can you really separate those sensory elements that Zumthor's talking about
Yeah.
from the city as a whole?
Right, it's all connected.
And that's where someone like Jan Gale comes in.
Oh, yeah, he's all about designing for people, not cars, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He says that when you make a city walkable and create inviting public spaces,
Mm-hmm.
you get more social interaction and a stronger sense of community.
It's like that saying, if you design for cars, you get more cars. If you design for people, you get more people.
Exactly.
And I love how Gale focuses on those in-between spaces.
Yeah.
Like the plazas, the sidewalks, those little passageways.
It's easy to forget about them.
But they're so important for making a city feel alive.
They are. And that's where I think Zumthor and Gale actually complement each other really well.
That's so interesting because they seem so different at first.
I know. But they both put the human experience first.
Okay, so let's try to tie this all together.
Okay.
We've got Zumthor talking about these atmospheres using sensory elements.
All right.
And we've got Gale saying we need cities that are good for people and that we should pay attention to those in-between spaces.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like in real life?
Okay, so imagine this. You have a narrow walkway between two buildings.
Okay.
Just a plain corridor that gets you from A to B.
Gotcha.
Now imagine Zumthor comes in and starts playing with light and shadow and different textures.
I like it already.
And then Gale comes in and adds some benches and maybe a little fountain, some plants to make people want to stop and hang out.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
Suddenly that boring corridor isn't just a way to get somewhere.
It's a place to meet up with a friend or take a break.
Right, it becomes part of the life of the city.
It's amazing how these ideas, even though they come from such different places, work so well together.
They really do.
It makes you think about design in a whole new way.
Yeah, it really does.
It's kind of funny how even when these articles talk about something like bioclimatic architecture,
Yeah.
it's not just about making buildings that are good for the environment.
Right.
It's like there's this other layer of making you feel something too.
Definitely. And it's almost as if the point isn't just to use less energy
Mm-hmm.
or pick the right materials,
Which are obviously still important.
of course,
Yeah.
but it's bigger than that.
It-
It's about making spaces that are really good for us just by connecting us back to nature.
Yes, exactly. And it makes me think about Louis Kahn,
Oh, yeah,
another architect who thought about way more than just the building itself.
he did.
Like he said that thing about how even a brick wants to be more than just a brick.
I love that quote.
It wants to be part of something bigger.
Yeah.
Something that means something.
Right, and you see that a lot in his work.
You do.
That idea of buildings as a spiritual offering.
Yes.
Like they go beyond just being physical objects.
And become something more.
They reflect our values and hopes and everything.
Exactly. And I know he wasn't talking about things like bioclimatic design specifically,
Right.
but you can see how it all fits together.
For sure.
When you design a building to work with the environment, to use natural light and airflow, it's not just about being efficient anymore.
No, it's not.
It's about making a space that just feels good to be in.
Totally. And it makes you think about Latin America in a whole new way.
It really does.
With all their traditions and that deep connection to the land.
Mm-hmm.
It's like modern design doesn't have to be so cold and sterile.
Right.
It can be something that speaks to us on a deeper level.
It's like that saying, we shape our buildings and then they shape us.
Oh, I like that one.
This whole conversation has really made me realize how true that is.
Me too.
It's all connected.
It is. It's like this constant conversation
Right.
back and forth between us and the spaces we create.
And these architects we've been talking about, they all add something to that conversation.
You really do, even if they're coming from totally different perspectives.
So where does that leave us? We've talked about how limiting it can be to only think about architecture from a European point of view.
Yeah.
We've seen how much creativity there is in informal settlements
Mm-hmm.
and how powerful it is to create spaces that make us feel something.
It's all about challenging the way we think about design.
Totally. And not just about how it looks, but how it makes us feel.
Absolutely. And what it says about us as a society.
Exactly. So next time you're walking around your city,
Okay.
I know I will pay attention to those little spaces.
Yeah.
The ones we usually just walk right past.
The in-between spaces.
Exactly. Ask yourself, do they make you want to stop and look around?
Right. Do they make you feel anything at all?
Maybe that's where really great architecture comes from.
Maybe it does.
Those little moments that catch you by surprise
I love that.
and make you see the world a little differently.